I don't know whether any of you are familiar with these, hopefully not from first hand, but the first one was Wanna Cry, makes you want to cry. And this one is the most recent one, which has got an evolving name. It started out as being called Petya. It's not called Not Petya, and it's now called Eternal Petya because the branding people can't quite make their minds up what to call it. But at the end of the day, it's ransomware. And that is the sort of latest thing in web security. And my talk today is going to be about website insecurity and the sorts of problems your website or your servers, your systems are going to face. So I'm not going to talk about your desktops that get attacked by ransomware, but I am going to show how that has a relevance to when you run server infrastructure. I'm George. I co-founded Blue Bag with Guy over there about 17 years ago. And we mostly do Drupal. And the slides are going to be available. I've got a little pointer here. And my Twitter is there. And I will tell you when the slides are available online if you follow me. Right, so website security. What we're going to look at is hackers. And what do hackers do? What are we up against? I'm going to look a little bit about cryptocurrency because that's become the big thing in certainly in ransomware and other threats that we might face. That's the payment of choice. How to become a Bitcoin billionaire, if you want to take notes. I'm going to look at some exploits and how we can protect ourselves and not become a victim. And I also want to spend some time looking at content security policies, which is the best way that you've got in protecting your web application delivery to the clients within the browser. If we have time, and I'm notoriously overrun, so we'll see how we get on, I will look at a case study that sort of encapsulates all that, not only how to identify threats that you face, a particular threat and how it works, but also how you can respond to that and recover from it. So why is the web insecure? Why am I talking about website insecurity? Well, security generally is perceived to be quite complex, and people think generally that it's somebody else's responsibility, and we generally, typically, none of us take it seriously enough. And the web itself is a very easy place to get up and running on. It's full of people who are well-meaning and put up sites without a thought, and it's also full of people who take advantage of that. And web software and the infrastructure we run that web software on is inherently insecure by default. It's very easy to get up and running on things. The defaults are very easy so that you can get up and running very quickly. And the responsibility to lock it down and actually make it secure is something that we should take and generally, typically, people don't do enough of. But it's also become, over the last few years, a place of very automated exploitation. So it's not one-on-one exploitation. It's not someone trying to attack you. It's someone trying to attack the whole web and fishing for opportunities for exploiting systems. And very importantly, the one message I want to get across is that often our goals and certainly our budgets tend not to include a security element, and they tend to end when we launch our sites. And our sites, once we're really happy and we've popped the champagne and we've all congratulated ourselves and tweeted about our new site, we tend to not really pay much attention to it from that point on. We'd certainly pay attention to the content and we pay attention to how it looks on the front end. But we cross our fingers and we hope we don't get a call from someone telling us, oh, the website's down, or there's a horrible thing on the website. But security's not hard, and any effort will be rewarded. And I'm hoping to show you how some really simple techniques are easy to implement. They don't cost a lot, they're very automatable, and they are very good at protecting us. So I started off with that screen looking at WannaCry and Petya, and I thought that was quite interesting because it covers a wide range of topics that I'm going to look at. And those topics tend to be supported by myths and fake news. We've got the best fake news when it comes to insecurity on the web. One of the big myths is that it hit outdated XP PCs. Actually, that's not actually true. It actually hit mostly Windows 7 and unpatched Windows 10 PCs. That's not a reason you should be using XP. Another myth is that it was that the exploit vector was by people opening infected email attachments. That's not actually true. It was infected by unpatched vulnerable SMB services in the Windows system that was exploited by the NSA in America. Developed a whole series of exploits across Windows software, which were leaked, as you probably know, through WikiLeaks, through the shadow brokers. And all those exploit tools are made available online, and there was a massive take-up of those tools to people, and that's why we've seen a massive launch on exploiting unpatched vulnerable Windows systems. There's another myth, is that it made a lot of money. Well, it did actually make a lot of money. It made about £90,000, but they're too scared to cash that in. And if you look at the Bitcoin wallets associated with those accounts, they haven't drawn on that money at all. Another myth is that it's private individuals, that it's script kiddies, that it's people sitting somewhere in the Eastern Bloc trying to target individual machines. And actually the wisdom these days is that it actually points to nation states. So we've got an exploit tool that was developed by a nation state, America, potentially, arguably, unconfirmedly being used by a nation state like the Democratic Republic of North Korea. That's just politics. So how do we not be a victim of things like ransomware? And this is why it becomes a good lesson across all of our systems. If you'd updated with the Windows patches that Windows released in response to the NSA informing them about the vulnerability once their tools had been exposed, you would have been okay. If you'd locked down your systems and you didn't have the SMB ports open in the first place, you would have been okay. If you'd backed up your files, you'd have been okay, because you could restore from a backup and you wouldn't have to pay a lot of bitcoins and potentially not even get the key to unencrypt them. And in fact, the Petya one is now known as wiperware, not ransomware, because all the indications from the source code are that they couldn't decrypt your files even if you paid them, yet people are paying them. Backups. We should all back up. We should all test our backups. All of the things that I'm going to show you, all of these problems that we may face can be solved by having good backups that you can restore and that you've tested. And in reality, most of these attacks are no worse than disk failures. If you had a hard disk failure, you would have lost all your files. You would have had to resort to a backup. So if you defend yourself against a catastrophic issue like a hard disk failure, you're also defending yourself against ransomware. So in web security generally, what actually is the risk to all of us here? Well, there's loss of business. We do a lot of our transactions online. We run most of our businesses online. We develop sites for clients who run their business online. We run the risk of losing our business and the reputation of ourselves and our clients. We also run the risk of leaking sensitive data, personal data, and there are new laws which I'll go into coming out next year in the EU, which will actually make you responsible for disclosing that your sensitive data has been leaked. Also, we suffer the risk of SEO ranking. We spend a lot of time and effort making sure our sites rank well on SEO. One of the biggest problems is sites losing their ranking, getting blacklisted by Google, for example. And of course, ransomware, which we've also discussed. So how much money should you spend on web security? We haven't got a budget. We haven't had budgets in the past. Well, the common theory at the moment is that you should spend about a third or more of what you expect to lose. There's a law of diminishing returns, obviously. And that's something which you need to think about. How much money should you spend? But of course, at the heart of it, I'm a big Ansible user. The heart of it is that you should be able to automate all your rebuilds. You should be able to rebuild and recover very, very quickly. It shouldn't be something that you have to panic. It should be something you've planned for. And you should have immutable infrastructure. You shouldn't have servers that you're so worried about that you can't rebuild and replace overnight or within minutes. So the EU have brought out the general data protection regulations, which come in place next year. I'm not going to go into too much detail. I'll just show you the major points here. But this is something, if you haven't thought about, if you're dealing with personal data, this is something that you will have to start thinking about. Brexit won't affect you here. It'll still be a responsibility. And one of the big things here is not only that we consent to data is going to change, but also that any breaches for data breaches are going to be something that you're responsible for, and potentially the fines will be 4% of your global turnover, or 20 million, which is whichever's the more. Okay, 4% in my case. So hackers, who are they? Well, there's a whole different range of different people who hack websites. There's your defacers. There's people who inject SEO spam for Jimmy Choo shoes or Viagra into your websites. There's data breaches, which have got a high-profile news and coverage these days. There are hacktivists, people who attack sites for political reasons, like Anonymous and like. There's also a vast array of botnets that have been created, where vulnerable and compromised servers are being used as an anonymous network to launch attacks from. And I will go into that in a bit more detail. But those are the sorts of botnets that are delivering ransomware. There's also the typical attacks like DDoS. And also there's your unintentional, where you've got an endpoint on your application which you don't really want to be hit very hard. Someone finds that as a vulnerability, hits it really hard, and your website can go down. So you have a responsibility in your code to profile your code that you're not presenting your own DDoS risk inadvertently. So, defacers. This is one of the most common types of hacks. Certainly it's one of the most visible. I always use this slide because Friday night in my house is curry night. So I don't buy my curry online, but if I was going to buy my curry online, I reckon this place would be a pretty good place to go and order your curry. Unfortunately, the Friday night in question, there was an ISIS all-you-can-hate buffet. And that had been taken. And that is a very common attack. It's actually not so common these days because ISIS are a little bit busy at the minute. But over the past year or so, that was very common. And sites, what they do is they compromise your site, whatever vulnerability, outdated software, shells on the server, and just remove the whole of your site and replace it with one page promoting whatever they want to promote. Now, I used to show a lot of other slides here, but I thought given we're in Bristol University, I'd have a little nose around the Bristol University website. It's a bit cruel, I know. Came across this site. This is a site that they might have even forgotten about. Certainly looks fine on first look. You can navigate that site, nothing untoward there. However, if you change, this is very common, if you change your user agent to Googlebot, I'm going to visit this site now as Googlebot, and if you go into the CSS and turn off a few things which bunged stuff off screen, you'll see a whole load of farmer hack spam has been injected onto the page. So the manager of this site would be completely unaware of that unless they tested their site under Googlebot or unless they searched on Google for Viagra and their site. I'll show you how to do that. And that's a pretty common one. It's a WordPress site. I won't go and say any more about that. Another site, a student union newsletter site on the university. You can go and have a look at these yourself. They're current. I will be disclosing this to them in the week coming. This is a WordPress site. Oops, sorry. Bit out of date. Not too bad out of date. That version protected it from the serious REST API vulnerability that WordPress had some while ago. But as you can see, visible without changing your user agent, they've introduced a Viagra shop and a Cialis shop on the site. Interestingly enough, the originators of this hack are from Germany. So when you go there, if you want to buy a Viagra, you better speak German. A common one as well is content injection. This is a site, I think this isn't current, but this site here, you can see a script is injected on via a content compromise. And if you visited that site, you actually will get sent straight over to Jimmy Choo Shoes. Now, all of those things will affect those sites' SEO ranking and they'll get blacklisted by Google. So it's not something you want, and it's something you should protect against, and it's something you should regularly check for. I'll briefly cover data breaches. It's certainly one of the most high-profile things. It's certainly something that affects us regardless of whether we are web developers. Password reuse is the biggest problem that we all face. If you reuse passwords and someone doesn't look after your data, your email combination and your password combination, you use that for LinkedIn, but you also use it for Google. Someone gets that, they've got your Google. Big ones were these dating sites. One for personal relationships and one for business relationships. They were high-profile ones. And, of course, there were lots more. Billions and billions of password email combinations are available online for people to hash and crack those passwords and use for whatever they want. Change your passwords. Don't reuse passwords. Use a password manager. Also, visit this site, Have I Been Pwned, which is by Troy Hunt. And you can put your email address in, as you can see I did, and see whether or not your email address features in any of those things. But generally speaking, that's all anecdotal. Don't reuse your passwords. Change any passwords related to anything that's been breached. Mark Zuckerberg, you'd think would be a bit wiser. He didn't. He used a really great password, and he used that password on his LinkedIn. It got breached. He used the same password on his Pinterest and Twitter account. So immediately that was released, his password was compromised. Pretty embarrassing for someone that runs a state-sized digital company. Right, so Bitcoin. I said a little foray into the world of Bitcoin. So we all want to become Bitcoin millionaires. That's the bandwagon we want to jump on. That's the new gold rush, right? So how do you become a Bitcoin millionaire? Well, the first way to become a Bitcoin millionaire, as we discussed, is use an exploit like Eternal Blue. I don't know why I think it sounds like a pregnancy tester, but it does. Go to the NSA hack tools and find yourself another tool like DrupalCamp. Use the Eternal Blue to attack machines that are vulnerable to SMB. Use DrupalCamp to inject your ransomware or whatever it is you want to inject. You're laughing. Set yourself up a Bitcoin wallet. Here's one example of one of the 3 Bitcoin wallets that was associated with WannaCry. You can see that's one. They actually got about £90,000 worth of Bitcoin in there. None of it's been drawn on. Make loads of money, £90,000. That's not too bad, apart from the fact that it's dangerous to cash in, and the fact that you're going to get hunted by every major nation-state security service, and the fact that you're going to live the rest of your miserable life in fear. So, not a great advert for that. All right, and the other way you can do it, it's a very common way, is you build a Bitcoin mining rig. Anyone got a Bitcoin mining rig? Really handy. What you do is you get a load of high-end graphic cards and you use those graphic cards to try and crack the hash of the latest Bitcoin block in order to create the nonce that you need. You get 5 Bitcoins if you do that, pay for your own electricity, buy your graphics cards. You can't get them because there's a global shortage because everyone's trying to do it. But you don't get a lot of return, you've got to pay for your power, there's not a lot of profit. So what you do is you join a mining pool where you contribute to the processing power of everyone on the pool. You pay for your own electricity, you get commensurate return for the amount of processing you do, and you can probably earn yourself about $8,000 a year. That'll pay for your graphics card, pay for your electricity. Does it pay for your time? It's barely worth it. It's interesting, it's fun, nerdy. Popular, so popular that not only the graphics cards become globally unavailable, but Asus has developed this new super duper graphics card which is specifically designed for mining and doesn't even have video outputs on it. I mean, that's crazy, right? I mean, that is a nerdy thing that's now become mainstream, so much so that a major hardware manufacturer is producing hardware specifically for it. Well, I can't be bothered with that. The better thing to do is mine using somebody else's power. So use a thing of vulnerability like the Samba Cry vulnerability, which attacks Samba machines. Use double pulsar or eternal blue or something like that and inject your cryptocurrency mining software on somebody else's server. All right, that sounds a pretty good idea. Keep it nice and quiet. They think their website's running okay. Meanwhile, in the background, you're mining for your BitCurrency. That now has become one of the biggest threat vectors that there is, because you can compromise hundreds of thousands of machines. If you want to compromise SMB, this is a widely publicized, hard to think of a vulnerability that's happened in the last 10 years, something that was so widely publicized as the WannaCry, right? Especially in this country with the NHS. You can still go and get 1 million machines if you want to set up your mining rigs on. I mean, that's a worry, right? If you want to use a botnet, get one. If you can buy one off the shelf for about 300,000 machines. Go on the dark web, you can buy that one that was set up by the Mirai worm. That's a very famous one a few years ago that uses vast hundreds, millions of compromised IP cameras that are all using the default credentials, admin password, that sort of thing. They're all compromised, all got embedded software on. You're good to go whether you want to deliver spam or whether you want to deliver your mining. Not just mining opportunities, of course. You can go for other types of ransomware. People using MongoDB, MySQL, put their database up, the site's working, everyone's happy. What they didn't realize was the port's open, they've used default passwords or it's compromisable in some other way. Somebody else logs onto the database, steals all your data, ransoms it back to you. Okay? So it's not just about your website being defaced. The pain doesn't necessarily have to end there. The pain can be that you've lost all your data and you've got to buy it back. If you look at Elasticsearch, I took this the other day, 160,000 Elasticsearch data servers online that I could access right now because they haven't got any protection on. Think of that for a bit. It's not just Elasticsearch databases. A lot of people have things that are, everything's got Internet of Things capability. There's toasters, there's washing machines, there's fridges, all sorts of things. You can go on there and you can see if Gerald's sparrows have returned to his feeders. You can go and see if Monica's put the bins out. Or if you just want something a bit more peaceful, you can go and look at a fish tank. Or maybe attack a super yacht. That's pretty cool, hey? Go onto a super yacht, start sending off the fire alarms. That might be quite amusing. If you want something a bit bigger, go and attack a hydroelectric control system. Go and reset the controls on a dam. There was a case 2 years ago in Germany where compromised a nuclear power facility. The latest Petya attack made the control systems on Chernobyl stop using their Windows automated control systems and had to go back to manual control systems because of this sort of a thing. This is not just voyeurism of somebody's sparrows. This is potentially a nuclear disaster, right? So hackers, they have it really easy. Insecure servers, we've covered that. People using default settings and passwords. Open configuration files where you can go and get the password even if it isn't the default. And folders are browsable. Sometimes people leave index browsing open on their server, or they're using out-of-date plugins. Obviously, there's things like SQL injection, phishing, that's a big one, and leveraging other people's data breaches, password reuse. And then there are search engines, as you've seen, where you can go and get exploits. You can get the details of the exploit, you can download the software, and you can also use the search engine to go and find machines that are vulnerable. You do not have to be an expert to play in this. And you can get a botnet if you want to anonymize yourself and do it at scale. Right, so out-of-date CMS core. We all know about that, right? We're lucky in Drupal. We have an excellent security team that keep us on our toes. But be aware, they only provide the security protection for stable releases. So if you're using dev releases, release candidates, betas, someone's sandbox, you're not protected, and that's your responsibility. If you're using WordPress, large numbers of third-party plugins are vulnerable. One of the big ones is this one here, Next Gen Gallery. You'll see, if you go through your logs, you'll see constant phishing for people trying to see whether you're using Next Gen Gallery plugin, because you can just upload files to it, upload a shell, and you're good to go. Misconfigurations. We've all done it. We should all not do it. We should all hit anyone that does it. But you go onto production and you make an edit to your settings file or your WordPress configuration file, but that's a bit of a pain. If you get it wrong, the site goes down. So obviously, sensibly, you want to back that up. What do people do? They back it up with a .text or .back extension. Suddenly, it doesn't get the protection that it had before because it's a PHP file. And as you can see, the username and password is readily available to anyone who wants to go and look at that. You can search on Google for these files. There's plenty of them around. Anyone who does that is unlikely to have secured their SQL database, and so you're in. Other types of things is where people leave index browsing on web servers. Certainly it's something you should turn off. You tend to by default. Drupal's HC Access, if you use it, does that by default for you, but it's a very easy mistake to make. A lot of people do it. Go to a WordPress configuration directory. There you are. All the files, you can just browse them. Big consequences. There was one recently where hundreds of thousands of people's personal private medical records were available online from a consultants that they'd used, and they just left them online as PDF files. You could find them in Google. I mean, that's a serious consequence of people's private personal medical data. It's just totally unacceptable. So how does someone take control of your Drupal site or your site once they've got access to those sort of things? Well, a DrupalGeddon site like this, you have a shell that you upload. Once you've got a shell uploaded to the site, you see you can browse any folders you like. You can go and have a look at the settings.php file. You can read that. You can see that this file is vulnerable and was attacked because it was a pre-DrupalGeddon patch site. You can still find these sites available online. So what does it do? I don't know how many of you know this, but on Drupal 7, if you had a variable in the settings to variables table called session inc, Bootstrap would load that in preference, lovely variable get, to the sessions inc. So what you do, if you can attack a site with SQL injection, so it's not a tutorial, by the way, this is what other people do and you should protect against, right? And what you do is you put this in the settings variable that you've injected into their database. You call the original one, obviously, because you still want the protection and you don't want to give yourself away, and you use that to upload a shell. So that's how these sites get compromised. As I say, you can use the internet for things like Showdown, as we saw. Go and find your things. You can use Google Docs if you're not familiar with those. That's a way of using special fields in Drupal in Google search so that you can search for a file changelog where it hasn't got the text, well, it has got the text Drupal, has got the text SA core, it hasn't got the text 7.32, and it's not from GitHub or Drupal.org, where you see a lot of examples of settings.php files, and you'll find live PHP files from Drupal sites that are vulnerable to DrupalGeddon if you want them. If you don't really know how to attack sites, exploitdb will give you a list of all the possible exploits. You go in there and you can search for those and decide whether you want to use them. Once you've done that, you can show off to your sad buddies and show that you've defaced a site on a site like ZoneH, which highlights, I did this, aren't I great? A lot of people just trawl the web looking for files. They just trawl. If you look through your logs, you will regularly see that people are searching for files that they shouldn't be looking at. They don't know they exist. As you can see, they don't exist. But if you scan the internet with that crawler, you will get results at some point, and people try that. So what should you do? Well, you need to control leakage. Why give people a heads up as to what your software you're using, and so that they know how to exploit it. You need to make sure that all your files have the restricted access that's required so that they don't become vulnerable. But you also have a layered defense. Security needs to be end-to-end. It's not something that you do, oh, that's a really good piece and I'll leave it there. It's something where you'll see there's a whole layer of defenses that you have to deploy. So information leakage, now that's a very contentious subject in information security OPSEC community. People don't like that because they tend to equate it with obfuscation. Obfuscation is nonsense. You can't use obfuscation, it's ridiculous. If you try and obfuscate the fact that you're using Drupal, someone will find out. It's very easy. And if you think that's protected you, it hasn't. And you'll get derided by the security community if you claim otherwise. Obfuscation is mental. Pros, a layered defense has as its component a protection against information leakage. If you don't let people read your changelog.txt, they won't know what version of Drupal, they won't know that you're using outdated Drupal, and they probably won't attack you, and they'll probably move on. So as a component of your defense, it has value. Most of these exploits do that sort of thing, where they trawl around looking at changelog.txt file. If you go through your logs, you'll see people are looking at your changelog.txt file constantly. And it's a very simple thing to do, but it's only a very small component. Other big security misconceptions that people have is that you should change the port that you use for certain things like SSH. I won't use 22 because people will try and hack 22. Everyone knows SSH on 22. I'll use a clever thing. A lot of hosting providers do this. I'll use 222 or 2020. It's a really, really bad idea. One reason it's a bad idea is because people scan all your ports all the time. Your machines that are publicly visible on the website are getting scanned for all open ports all of the time. So they'll find 222 anyway, right? Also, it's a false sense of security because you've done something which is pointless, but it makes you feel good. You think you've done something and you move on, and actually you've achieved nothing. So that's bad. Better protect security for particular endpoints like SSH. Protect it properly with private keys, with IP restriction. Allow groups. Don't allow root to login. That will solve most of the exploits that you were otherwise likely to face. It's also very poor security because actually ports above 1024 are non-privileged ports. So any malware on your server could masquerade as a port above 1024 and pretend to be SSH and get access to your server. And also it doesn't give you the protection that might inherently be there for the systems that protect the privileged ports. Okay? So that's a common misconception. Avoid that if you can. On the server, be aware of what ports you have open. So if you're running a typical sort of LAMP stack, maybe with a load balancer or some sort of proxy system in front of it, you'll find that you're exposing things like Varnish and MySQL and Memcache and Redis and Webmin and Monet and all those sorts of things. Now, very few of those things need to be publicly accessible. You might want to be able to access them, but you should check, if you can, using something like a Tor circuit so that it anonymizes your IP and it's not one that's listed, and make sure that they're not visible from outside. And these are checks that you should do, and you should automate if you can, to make sure that someone hasn't opened up one of those ports inadvertently and making you vulnerable where otherwise you wouldn't be. Also, web software tends to be inherently vulnerable out of the box. I don't know how many of you know this, but if you use Apache, out of the box, Apache has got a module called mod negotiation. You might know that there's a minus multi-views in a lot of if you look at your htaccess files. But what mod negotiation does, is a very good example of a vulnerability that you don't want, is if I come to your website and I search for a file called dump, and you've got files called dump.sql and dump.txt, if I spoof the accept header so that it doesn't, try and guess what it was I asked, it will return and say, oh, I haven't got a file called dump, but I've got this SQL and this .txt file, if you like. So you're advertising a lot of information which you otherwise don't need to do, and it gives you a nice page with a link to those files. It's actually, you probably wanted my dump.sql, didn't you? Right, so disable those, certainly use minus multi-views if you can't disable it, and don't allow directory indexing. But also be aware of all the other modules like mod status and user directory and mod info, all those modules that get enabled by default. You should just go and turn those off if you can. And same with the configuration of PHP. Within your htaccess, or within, I don't use htaccess files as a performance hit for doing so, I use vhost files, but if you don't have that access to those, you can do it in htaccess. Turn off any public folder, certainly turn off indexes, turn off, or allow symlinks, but only where the owner matches, and turn off multi-views. Those are maintained for you in the Drupal htaccess if you use the htaccess. Otherwise, make sure you migrate those to the vhost file that Drupal otherwise isn't providing you with. In your public folders and anywhere else but the root of your website, turn PHP off. There's no reason for anyone to be able to run PHP in your files folder. If someone uploads a file masquerading as a PHP file, or uploads a PHP file because you've got public uploads available on your Drupal site, they could upload a shell and just run it. Okay? Turn off PHP. It doesn't need to run. And in private files directory, turn off PHP and deny access, because the only thing that needs access to your private files directory is Drupal. The whole point of the private files directory is that the files are served via the web server and they don't need public access. Also, one thing I do is I don't actually allow people to read any text files on my site, and I don't allow anyone to read or run any PHP files on my site apart from index. The only file, PHP file, that you need people to run on your site is index.php. Then nothing else needs to run. Everything's done through that single point of entry. If you're worried about it, you want to run things like, if you want to, run update or something like that, or you've got custom PHP files, then password protect it or protect it with an IP address. Also, if you do, again, not advised, but if you have a Git repository on your website, make sure that you've got access to those sorts of folders turned off as well, so people can't browse and find your Git credentials or otherwise compromise your security. And protect all of the other file types that people don't need to access. Again, this is in the Drupal htaccess file, but this means actually that people can't actually access files with a .back or .orig or .save or, turns off all access to all those sorts of files for you. Analyze attack patterns. So as I said, go through your logs and see what sort of things people are attacking you for and make sure that you're protected against those. Maybe protect your admin paths. And in this example, people are sniffing for PHP, but very commonly you'll find if you go through your logs that they're actually searching for dumps. They use the site name, they use standard names, dump, test, backup, this, that, the other, all the different file extensions. They've got plenty of time on their hands to browse the whole internet for dump files that they can otherwise download. Clearly, the best advice is don't dump or edit in production. Use other things like mod evasive, mod security, fail to ban, monitor your logs. Be aware of how your application is being used. Be aware of what sort of things people are sniffing around and how they're using your application, and lock it down. If you can, use an intrusion detection system, IDS, like the OSEC one, freely available open source thing. That's great. If files change on your web server, you'll get told about it. So you can, even though you're not visiting the website or looking at the server every day, if something does change, if, for example, a colleague of yours inadvertently changes the permissions on the settings.php file and makes it writable because they edited it on the server, you'll get told about it. Skip that one, I'll skip that one, I'll skip that one. So, security in the browser. Content security policy is something which we should all be thinking about implementing. I'm not going to talk about HTTPS. Every site should be on HTTPS. There's no good reason for not having a site on HTTPS. There's no performance hit. It makes everything secure. If the whole site is under HTTPS, it is easy. It used to be hard if you had to context switch between HTTP and HTTPS. You can get free certificates from Let's Encrypt. Enough said. Every site should be HTTPS. Every site should also, though, implement security header browsers, like security headers, server headers, to protect against the most common front-end vulnerabilities that we face, which are cross-site scripting, cross-site request forgery, where people can take an endpoint of your web application and have a tab open because they fished it through an email and it can start interacting with other tabs, or they can steal cookies from your website because they're running off the same browser. As important as these things are, and as encourages everyone to do this, if you look at the top 1 million websites, the take-up is horrific. Yeah, fairly few of them scrape above the 1% mark, which is absolutely atrocious, because implementing these headers will protect you from these common things out of the box. I mean, what you can see from there is that the take-up is increasing. That's percentages for you, right? 100% nothing is not great in advance, is it? So there's a lot of information. There's a lot of really good guides out there. This particular one is great, I think. It's the Mozilla Security Guidelines. It not only shows you all of the different headers and practices which you can deploy, but it also gives you pretty handy. I mean, to a certain extent, you should just deploy all of them. Not necessarily all relevant to you, and they also have lesser or greater implications to your time, not least what the security benefit is. So that's a pretty handy table to have a look at to see which ones you should definitely prioritize. The high security ones, definitely prioritize the high security, low difficulty ones, and but it's something you should review. So what are we talking about here? Every site should have an X-content type options no sniff. Old versions of browsers used to do a thing which, if they got a JavaScript file that said it was a BMP file, Internet Explorer and old copies of Chrome, old versions of Chrome, used to say, oh, actually, that's not a BMP, that's a Java. I'll treat it as a JavaScript file. Well, that's really bad. You don't want people doing that, because it means I could upload a JavaScript file as a BMP file or an SVG file to your public files folder and then run it as a JavaScript file. So what this header says is, I'll tell you what type of file this is, and you treat it as such. Many years ago, when I started writing websites, we used to put JavaScript in called frame-busting JavaScript. I don't know how many of you used to do that. You don't see it much these days, but it stopped someone putting your page inside a frame, right? You don't see it much these days, but it's still a massive attack vector where if I encapsulate your site within my site, within a frame, I have access to the DOM of your site on older browsers. Having said that, X-frame options just stops that happening. If you try and put my site in your site in an iframe, the browser will just stop, won't allow it. The big difference here is that browsers these days are offering you a massive amount of help. All you have to do is put the headers in there to say, please help me out in this way. XSS protection. In the old versions of IE and Chrome, they started to make decisions about how cross-site scripting protection could be employed on your site. And so they said, well, you know, I will allow this or I'll allow that. Actually, what you should do is turn it off and block. So what that does is just sets a default within the browser to say, don't allow scripts that are acting like they're cross-site scripting attacks. When you're all on HTTPS, as you should be, you can put this header on which says, once you've visited my site, I want you to only ever visit my site and resources on from my server as HTTPS. So even if someone else tries to get there on HTTP and I haven't got a redirect from one to the other, the browser will, from that point on, for a year, will say, I will only ever come back to your site under HTTPS, even if you've got a link on your site that says go to this page under HTTP. You can put a thing called, and you'll see this when you copy and paste from other people's advice, you'll see a thing called preload. Do that with care, because what that does, if over time, is it will add your site to a list of sites within the browser software that will always visit your site under HTTPS. If for some reason you had to turn HTTPS or something off, the browser would never give access to your site under HTTP only. So be aware of that. If that's what you want, that's great, but you'll see examples of people who have fallen foul of that. Secure cookies, that's a real problem. If your cookies are insecure, it's a real problem, and it's very easy to do. Make sure that your cookies are only readable HTTP, so if malicious JavaScript can't read your cookies or can't get access to that sort of information. Make sure that they're delivered securely, and also make sure that the cookies are only readable by software or pages from your site, right? And that's really easy to do. You just put a header setting the cookie to HTTP only, or you can do it in the Drupal settings file if you're on 7, where you can just say session cookie HTTP only, and if you're secure, set it as cookie secure. If you're using, as you should be, Drupal 8, that's set up for you out of the box. We all use scripts from other people's sites, like we use Bootstrap, or we use Typekit, or we use jQuery. It's possible, of course, that we're including JavaScript that's been compromised from someone attacking the CDN that delivers that. It's not something we can guard against, right? But if you put a sub-resource integrity, which is an SHA hash of the jQuery JavaScript, then what the browser will do before it incorporates that JavaScript and runs it, it will check the hash of the file it downloads against the hash you say, and will only run it if they match. Also, you can do things like public key pinning, which says, you know, my certificate you should only ever accept a certificate from me that conforms to these public keys, and that stops a sort of man-in-the-middle attack that you hear a lot about when public Wi-Fi is, where someone can steal your site and inject their own security certificate and spoof yours. Content security policy is the newest way of doing a lot of these things. And what a content security policy does, it defines the resources and the identity of resources that you're going to use on your site. So I'm going to use jQuery, so I will allow scripts from the jQuery CDN, or I'm going to use Google's fonts or something, so I'm going to allow you to incorporate fonts on my website as a browser that come from there. And anything else that gets asked for, I want you to deny access to. So if someone injects malicious content into your site that calls script from somewhere else, it will just deny it. That is a very powerful thing to protect you on a whole range of things. It does mean, though, that you have to start analyzing all the stuff that you include on your website, right? So you have to be aware of where your CSS is coming if it's not all local, where your fonts are coming from. If you're using New Relic, some of those scripts call scripts from somewhere else, so you have to whitelist all those sort of things. So it is a hard thing to do, but I'll skip that one, but what's really good about it is that there's a site, and you can set up your own. The browser, when the policy is violated, so if you go into your inspector in Chrome, as this example here, if you violate one of those policies, the browser will send, if you ask it to, a JSON packet to a reporting service to tell you that this policy is, that's amazing insight, right? You've got a site that's out there somewhere, and someone's injected content either via man-in-the-middle attack or via content injection on your site, and this reporting service, if you use it, which is Scott Helm's one, which I'd encourage you to have a look and use, you can go in there and you can see, hang on a minute, this weird script that I've never heard about is being injected into my site, and that's a very good insight to things which otherwise, we tend to, web delivery is a bit like chucking stuff over a brick wall, isn't it? We hope it all worked out all right, but we don't get much feedback here. So go and have a look at these. If you don't have access to server configurations and therefore can do it yourself, there's a great module called the Security Kit module, which is available as an alpha for Drupal 8, but stable for Drupal 7, which gives you, like meta tag module, it gives you access to setting all these headers and CSPs on your site as well. And there's some great resources. There's a resource by April King. She works for Mozilla, I think, and that's a plugin which says you can go and visit your site and it will build up all the resources that your site needs and develop a CSP for you. Scott Helm's got on his reporting website, has got a tool which enables you to do exactly the same thing, and you can build up a CSP and run that. And if you run it in reporting mode, it doesn't block anything, but will report, and you can fine-tune that, and when you're good to go, you can put it live. So what do we do about all this? How do we implement it? So a lot of stuff, right? And there's a lot of different bits here, a lot of different levels. We're closing off ports, we're denying access to files, we're protecting our files out in the wild. Well, we have to regularly review our application and how it's used. We have to think about all the potential attack surfaces, from not just from our server. What about, okay, we set up the server and someone says, oh, have we got off-site backups? Oh, I'll just set you an off-site backup. Well, is that secure? Is that being password protected? What if S3 gets compromised? That's extended your attack surface. So think about all those sorts of surfaces and all those sorts of places. Think about, people who back up in your office, back it up on a USB stick and then go out and leave it in a train or something. Audit all your attack surfaces. But also regularly test your defenses. Regularly test and make sure that all these things that you've put in place are still in place and are still protecting you. Have structured defenses, as we've said, and also really avoid complacency. It's very easy for people to say, oh, we did a lot of work on this, it's all SEO enabled, we spent a lot of money on this, we spent a lot of money on that, put it up there and just wait and keep your fingers crossed and hope everything's okay. Rebuild regularly. Don't be afraid. It's oh my God, I've attacked server 1, not server 1, I haven't touched that in years, it's on an old version of this. Don't be afraid. Build and rebuild servers. Be comfortable with rebuilding and redeploying your applications whenever you want, so that when you do respond to a problem, that isn't the problem you face, right? The problem that you face when you respond to a problem is the problem that you've got, not the inherent debt problem you've got because you don't know how to restore your backups, or the backups may not exist or don't work. And event monitoring. Monitor your events. Be aware of what caused traffic spikes on your website. Is it because you've got a poor performing endpoint on your server, or is it because someone's actually attacking you? But most importantly is give a rat's ass about it and make sure that every part of your organization thinks about it, is aware of those issues, and gives you time. And as developers, right? I mean, you actually want to have budget so that you can spend time doing this. We don't want to do it, but actually time is an issue, budget's an issue, and we shouldn't leave it just to ourselves. It should be something that top down, bottom up is deployed across your organization. So I think that's me. I'd welcome any feedback, that'd be really great, certainly, and certainly questions now if anyone's got any. Brilliant.
We've got about 2 minutes.
Okay, great, good.
Just out of interest, do people know what the fix for Petrol is?
Yeah, there's a very simple fix for it.
It's incredibly simple.
There's very simple, is turn your machine off and rebuild it.
Just copy Notepad, Perv C.
Oh, well, no, that is actually not necessarily the case. There's a lot of people have come up with a lot of examples like that, but I'd look into that because on some circumstances, that's not. Yeah.
It comes from bleeping computers.
Yeah, I know, but there is a contentious subject at the moment, and the landscape there is changing pretty much, and it's certainly got. It's been what they've done is they've recompiled, they've decompiled the software, and they've realised actually that it wasn't actually it was a multiply sort of hacked piece of thing. They reckon that it's not been compiled, it's been hacked, you know, and they just consider it to be, you know, wiperware. There's no point paying the ransom. It was just put out there, and so the actual motivation for it is something that people don't understand. A lot of people think it's just a way of testing the environment to see how effective it would be, but there's no way back from it. The only real way back from it. And the reality is if you've got to that point where you think you're connecting, you're already under attack, you know, because you're...
It's just on the train yesterday, I was sat next to a DR guy and they tested it.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean, they had the ransomware, the ransomware,
yeah.
and they did the change through...
Yeah. The problem is, and why its name's changing, is that there's a lot of variants out there, and yeah. But I mean, the point really there is, if you have a responsibility for this, is follow things like Bleeping Computer, follow things like people like Scott Helm and Troy Hunt, and you know, follow. I mean, don't get me wrong, I follow all these people. It gives me a blooming headache every day. You know, you can get a wealth of horror coming your way. So living in ignorance is certainly more helpful. But follow these people, and if you've got a responsibility for it, you know, keep up with that. That's absolutely right. And you know, it is an ever-changing landscape, so it's something that is. But most of these things I've talked about here, they will protect you against 99% of the most common threats that are around, and that they aren't changing, and they are established standards which you can implement very simply. So that's kind of cutting-edge vulnerability, really, that is, you know, very difficult to get ahead of, really. Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
We need to move on to the next.
Okay, sure.